Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Ferry. I'm a new assistant professor at the Copenhagen Business School. And the paper I'm going to talk to you about, I think you can see my slides, but the paper that I want to talk about is still very much in development. It's even changed its shape since I submitted the initial proposal. And so I want to talk through just what I'm thinking about, and I definitely want feedback, not the kind of feedback when people come to conferences and they say like, I want feedback, but the paper's already written kind of feedback, but like this is still very much an in development paper. So I still want to think about things to look out for, things to consider, things I'm not thinking about, and such as I get into this, because I'm really in just sort of the initial data analysis process. So and then before I start, just to give some context, so this paper came about because a friend and colleague of mine, Mary Olbein, who I know many of you are familiar with, she and I were talking about kind of how to get started, because I have a background in cultural studies, and so I'm very comfortable talking about gender, race, and class, and sexuality and difference and things like that. But now I was at CBS and I had to sort of do that in a business context. And so she said to kind of go to the literature, pull the top management journals and anything in there about gender and just start reading. And so that's essentially what I did. And now that's how this paper sort of came to be. And I amassed this sort of grand literature review, and I just started to notice some patterns about how we were talking about gender. And one of the articles I came across was this piece by Bridges and Messerschmidt, which was part of a collection that was honoring the work of Joan Acker. And I assume most people know who Joan Acker is, but just in case not, she was sort of an early sociologist to bring gender into discussions about organization and work. And so in this piece, they talk about this moment where Acker sort of advises that we move from discussions of patriarchy to discussions of gender. And it's in this 1989 article called The Problem with Patriarchy. And so in it, Acker talks about how gender might be a more useful category for our analysis. And so, prior to the 1989 article, so in the 70s and the 80s, in much social science research and some feminist research, patriarchy was a theoretically useful way to explain the oppression of women as it related to labor and marriage and reproduction and those kinds of things. But Acker and some other feminist thinkers, of course, pointed out some shortcomings of the concept of patriarchy. So the tendency to use it as this sort of universal transcultural phenomenon that all women are oppressed in the same ways everywhere, and found that to be somewhat limiting. And she said gender instead would prove more useful for examining, quote, processes and structures that previously had been conceived as having nothing to do with gender, end quote. And that gender, she thought, would lead researchers to ask better questions on men and masculinities, on gender and science, and then pertinent to her own work about gender in the organization. And we know that since Acker's article, gender has certainly become like the primary construct through which we kind of look at masculinity, femininity, and things like that. And patriarchy has sort of faded away. But despite Acker's insistence that it be gender and not patriarchy that we look at, she ends this piece with sort of a final warning, and one that is particularly of interest for my work here. So she says, there's a danger in abandoning the project of patriarchy. In the move to gender, the connections between urgent political issues and theoretical analysis, which made the development of feminist thought possible, may be weakened. Gender lacks a critical political the critical political sharpness of patriarchy, and may be more easily assimilated and co-opted than patriarchy. And so I thought this was really interesting, because this sort of co-option of gender or a sanitized version of gender was what I was seeing in my large-scale literature review that I sort of mentioned at the beginning. And so although there's been this increase in studies on gender, whether such analyses have sort of maintained a perspective on gender as conceived by Acker as sort of this socially constructed and politically useful category to study both men and women was, I thought, sort of worth investigating. And so the goal of this analysis is not to understand what has been said about gender, the 7 traits of female leaders or what it might be, or women leaders, but it's to understand how gender has been conceptualized in leadership studies. And so against this we also have this backdrop where we have recent calls by Emma Bell and colleagues to sort of bring feminist theory back into management and leadership research, right? So with giving the changing political, terrain, Me Too, Time's Up, there's been an attention to make gender a priority for organizations. And Emma Bell and colleagues argue that not to ask feminist questions about gendered social relations at work in management and organizations is, in our view, to accept gendered inequities, inequalities, and violence that affect women in particular, and ultimately all of us. And so, gender is not synonymous with feminism. One can certainly study gender without using a feminist lens, but these recent papers sort of made clear that in order to better align current understandings of gender and management today, a feminist lens is useful in doing that. And so this proposed review that I'm thinking of will sort of bring a feminist lens and analysis into leadership research and how it deals with gender. And so sort of what I'm thinking is I'm thinking to use, or I have been using Acker's 1999 piece as a jumping off point, so studying literature from 1990 to 2021 or 22 or whenever I finish it. And I'm pulling from some top management, organization, and leadership journals and pulling the articles that are specifically about leadership and gender within those journals. And so that's about 415 articles as of now. And then I'm using deductive kind of coding and a feminist lens to again, think about how these articles conceive of gender, and then by extension, how leadership discourse conceives of gender. And feminist, theory and feminist lenses are certainly many things to many different people. Mine definitely leans towards a more post-structural feminist critique because I'm really interested in language and power and discourse and subjectivity. But there are some things I think that cut across many lenses, and so I'm going to kind of tell you the guiding questions that I use when I'm doing this research. So let's see if I can. Oh, I don't know how I did that. There we go. Okay. So the first question that I'm asking as I'm looking at these articles is, does the research talk about gender as a biological or natural attribute, or does it account for the social construction of gender? And so this is really about whether it finds gender to be sort of the property of the individual, women do this, men do this, or whether there's a recognition of masculinity and femininity and the fluidity there, and of gender as a socially constructed category. I'll go through each of these questions and I'll kind of show you preliminary findings. The next question that I'm asking is, does the research give attention to men and women or anyone else? And does the fact that men have a gender too, is that ever mentioned? And I know I'm using a problematic binary when I'm talking about women and men, but I'm just sort of reflecting what is in most literature. Despite the name feminist theory, does not just care about women's issues. And there's been more and more attention brought to the fact that we need to consider men and masculinities when we're thinking about striving for gender equity. And it seems that a lot of times when we say gender, people think women. And so I wanted to see if the article is giving any attention to the gender of men. The next one is gender research described in relation to power? So here we just wanted to see if any of the articles, or I wanted to see if any of the articles acknowledge that power relationships are intricately tied to gender. If you're using a feminist frame, gender and power are intricately woven. And so this was a question just to see, are the articles bringing any attention to those kind of power relationships? And then does it apply an intersectional lens? And so here we're just thinking about whether, or I keep saying we, there's no other we, it's just me, but I'm just thinking about, does the research consider other socio-political markers of identity? So race, socioeconomic status, ability, and so on. And intersectionality, it's not one that I really intend to find in some of the older articles, because it's sort of a term that's gained more and more momentum, even though it's been around for quite a long time in feminist circles, but it's kind of come into more mainstream discourse. And so I'm thinking more, is this appearing in more of our recent articles? And in terms of preliminary findings in relation to those questions, here's kind of what I'm seeing on a broad scale. Does it talk about it as socially constructed or essential attribute? And most research is essentializing or just not mentioning social construction. If it does talk about social construction, the closest or a lot of what I'm seeing in these top journals is social role theory. It gets brought up, but it's more people talking about gender as though women do this and men do this, and then no account for how identity is kind of a socially constructed category. The next one, gender is often meaning women. So I found whole articles where the entire sample is men, and yet it seems not to be a study on gender, but just a study on whatever they wanted to look at. But if you have an entire sample of women, it becomes a gender study. This is what women leaders do versus just this is what leaders do when the sample is entirely men. And then, in terms of does it mention power or anything like that, instead what we find is not a mention of power per se, but that gender is used as a variable for difference. So the men are from Mars and women are from Venus. So gender is often decontextualized and sort of separated from any kind of notions. And this is also true in terms of like interrelating and things like that. If they talk about men and women interacting, issues of power privilege are not necessarily there, and instead it's just about how people interact differently because they are women and men. And then, this one, not surprisingly, it's gender is often discussed just in isolation. So, and largely it's, and we know this in a lot of fields, but largely it's talking about primarily white women, or it's talking about women in CEO positions. There's a lot, of course, on like board representation and things like that. So that's kind of that 1% feminism argument, but women of color, women with disabilities, poor women, and things like that are not really mentioned. So all that said, the saucy provocation that I want to throw is, what do we do with gender? Do we ditch it? Do we go back to patriarchy? As sort of an aside, which we can talk about. I know I'm running out of time here. What I found is when we do talk about patriarchy, it tends to be something that happens elsewhere. So it's normally any of the articles that are published and they want to use the word patriarchy in the title. It's like patriarchy in India, patriarchy in Asia. It tends to be something that, like, of course, like white Western culture doesn't have, but it happens elsewhere, sort of this like Western superiority thing. So I think that that's very interesting that that's where patriarchy does end up. But anyways, I'll just end there with, do we keep gender or not? So thanks for listening. That's it.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole, for this great overview of gender and leadership. I will invite our participants to either raise hand or type in their questions in the chat box. But before that, I'll abuse my kind of chairing privileges a bit and ask, is it that we need to ditch patriarchy or gender as as concept, or is it that we need to kind of reconceptualize how we use them? Your thoughts about that, Nicole?
Yeah, I don't think we necessarily need to ditch either. I'm not. I'm more just trying to be a little bit provocative to push us to think, right, a little bit more about the terms that we use. I think I do think patriarchy, even with shortcomings, I think patriarchy is a useful theoretical concept that needs to be brought back into discussions much more when we do research on gender. And I don't think that we could ever really get rid of gender, nor do I want to, because I still find gender useful. I just think that sort of the dismissal of patriarchy in favor for gender, we lose something potentially with that I would be interested in keeping, maybe.
I totally agree with you. I think that both have merit, and it's mostly about kind of the analysis process rather than anything else. I see some hands raised. I don't think I can see who raised them. I think it's David Collinson. And yes, David, if you would like to, just turn your mic on and ask a question.
Thanks, Nella. Yes, that was really great. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk, Nicole. Just a point of being on it. It might be to do with my age, I don't know, but the debates about patriarchy predate your research. You cut off from at 1989, but really a lot of the debates about patriarchy were in the 70s and the 80s. So I am showing my age. I can't get around that one, I'm afraid. But, Sylvia Wolby's fantastic book, Patriarchy at Work, was 1986. She did another one in 1990. But, 1986 was and of course, you weren't looking at books either. You're only looking at articles. So you kind of are, in terms of building, I'm not criticizing your research. I'm just thinking in terms of building your argument for the second half of the paper, maybe. You could still, go revisit the dual. One of the big debates in American feminism was dual systems. Is it capitalism? Is it patriarchy? How do they interconnect? How do they contradict each other? What are the tensions? Those were really healthy debates in the 70s and 80s, and I was just a little bit disappointed. But at first, when you said you're starting at 1989, but I can see why you got to cut it off somewhere. But in terms of your analysis of patriarchy, you could, revisit those arguments with the lens of gender as well, to say, well, actually, all these things are important in different ways, and we shouldn't throw out patriarchy as we were just debating in another meeting there. And I agree completely. The other point I wanted to say was, in terms of intersectionality, you talk about these identity categories. And I don't know whether they are just identity categories, that they're embedded in material inequalities as well. And, the right can dismiss these sorts of arguments as sort of being about identity, work or identity politics, they call it. But actually, these are inequalities. They're embedded in material economic realities as well as symbolic ones of identity. So thank you. I thought it was a great paper, and all the best with it.
Yeah, thanks. Yes to everything that you said. So yeah, I mean, I do. Yeah, I'm familiar with Wolby, and I was reading a bunch of those papers, and that's what sort of got me thinking and got me excited. Even like grad school, that was the work that really got me excited. But I thought about doing sort of a contrasting paper between pre 1990s and post, and thinking about like what the articles were talking about and the discussions about there, and how gender was used when patriarchy was still in, and then what happened when it wasn't. But I had to I was thinking primarily, again, I don't know if this is a paper for me to necessarily argue for patriarchy as much as it is to understand how management and leadership conceives of gender. And what they conceive of gender as is I think starkly different than what we might want, think of when we think of patriarchy and the way that it constructs gender. It's a lot more sanitized version of gender. And so I think that was kind of my point, but I agree that it would be interesting to look at both things. And then in terms of intersectionality, it's the different social, political, oppressive forces that come to shape how we navigate, not just the identity markers. I totally agree with that. I'm not pro identity politics necessarily, but I'm trying to think about ways in which I can read these papers to think they give some attention to the fact that we are not just gendered, but we are also experience racial systems and class systems and different things like that. So I'll have to think more about that, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks both, David and Nicole. I think it's fascinating, and I'm really glad we have these discussions, because yeah, I think that depending on what you're researching and what you're looking at, each of these can have merit. You know, I don't know, I don't want to clog this space, but in researching, you know, corruption in institutions, patriarchy for me was that lens that helped me show how, you know, how these institutions use patriarchy as a tool, you know, for corruption. And, you know, elsewhere, gender or intersection of these various structural inequalities might be kind of better lens. So it all depends on kind of what you're interested in researching. But we have more hands raised. Magnus Larsen, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Nicole. It's great. Got it. I just have a sort of a question. I think it's it's a question. It's not a suggestion. But I was curious about the distinction between management and leadership. I mean, as a field. So, where is leadership in this, and what is distinctive about leadership? And is your argument that there is nothing distinctive, or is there something distinctive? And in that case, what? So, I guess I'm sort of driving towards the same distinction as between critical management studies and critical leadership studies. So is there something, or are we talking about management studies in general? Because I'm thinking there would be something, wouldn't there? I would expect something interesting in the leadership field that is distinctive, not least given sort of the heroism and masculinity associated with transformational leadership, charismatic leadership. So just about that distinction, and is there anything in that?
Yeah. Allow me to give you a super unsatisfying answer. So I think that when I initially started this, I just pulled from just top like 4-star journal, right? I just wanted to see what like the top journals in the field, according to these rankings, have to say about it. And they are largely, I mean, Leadership Quarterly is the only explicitly leadership. That's not to say leadership work doesn't happen in the other ones, but it was the only kind of 4-star journal. I certainly have opinions about the distinction or not between management and leadership, which is more than we have time for, but I tried to pull from these, more explicitly management journals, articles where the person was looking at leadership and gender in some kind of respect, whether it be in their keywords or abstract or things like that. So I am focusing on that, and primarily as an unsatisfying answer, it's because that's the field that I'm in. That's what I study. I study leadership, not management. Whether that's a difference is a different debate. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see. I would have to see after I'm done with this and go back and look at management and gender and see if there is some kind of a difference there in terms of doing it, or if there's a lot of conflating, because we know we conflate management and leadership a lot. And so I imagine what I see in leadership literature might also be in management literature. I don't imagine that management would treat gender wholly differently. That's a cynical way to look at it, but in these journals, I'm not sure that there's like a huge difference. Maybe there is, and I just need to look more. So I'll think about that though. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. We have a question from Olwine and then a question from Jackie Ford.
Yeah, I just lowered my hand because I'd much rather hear what Jackie says than what I have to say. So if there's still time, I'll ask something. So over to Jackie.
Well, we have another 2 minutes.
Then.
Yes. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks, Nicole. I think you raised some really fascinating issues in your presentation. And like you, probably I'm quite intrigued about the choice of the top journals, the 4-star journals, because I kind of almost predicted what you might find in those, a lack of anything other than essentialist takes, gender about women, etc., etc. And I'd be fascinated to either have it extended to other, maybe European or other wider influences. I was thinking of organisation studies or human relations organisation, because I think you might see a different complexity or perspective in some of those views. I'm also, like you, wrestling with this whole notion of what do we do about gender, and I'd love a wider debate on that, but maybe it's premature, and I'm struggling with similar issues really, but Yeah, I don't know if there's a question there. I just want a bit of solidarity, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, I avoided, you know, of course, journals like Gender Work and Organization and things like that. I think that they do have different discussions. It'd be interesting to see if how different, or if, you know, maybe we assume it's different. Maybe it's just a few good articles, or not good, feminist leaning articles that have a different take. I don't know. But you know, I've struggled with trying to how do I put this? I want to make a point, I guess, about like what we most respect, you know, in the 4-star journal category, and what it like it's I chose, do you know what I'm saying? So I'm trying to balance, like, I'm not trying to like pick on anybody, but if this is the word of management and organization and leadership studies, and they treat gender like this, and I use them, even though we could kind of assume maybe what they're going to say, I think it would still matter to have said it, and then people to draw on it, and then use that, and maybe make some changes in the way that they, you know, even if we just stop conflating gender with sex, that might be useful. You know, things like that. I don't know. So I struggle with that too, because I do know that there's some very excellent, solid feminist work in GWO and human relations and things like that. So I want to honor that. I don't want to dismiss that by saying like leadership discourse talks about it like this, when I'm only looking at these, you know, these journals. But I also want to say, like, if these are the top and this is how they talk about it, then maybe we've got a problem. So I don't know. I'm struggling. Yeah.
Thank you both. I see many raised hands, but unfortunately I have to cut this exciting and lovely discussion short because we have to move on with the other presentations.